Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our session about central bank learning through cooperation. My name is Mark Cousin. I am the Executive Director of the Reinventing Bretton Woods Committee. It's a think tank that has been established more than 20 years ago, in fact, to build a dialogue among policymakers, central banks, academic, private sector, on trying to improve the global financial architecture. So I would like first to thank our organizer, AIFC, for this annual conference. That was quite impressive as we cover many discussions over the last few days, and particularly to discuss exactly what is missing in Central Asia and what can be done here to try to enhance central bank cooperation. Is there a rationale for it? What should be the modalities? And in order to do that, we have an excellent panel. Unfortunately, our colleagues are not with us, but they are with us online, and they are coming from different parts of the world. Let me first introduce them to you, and after I will ask them to speak around 8 minutes, and we will go for a round of questions and answers. So, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us from different parts of the world. First, Aliya Moldabekova, she's the Deputy Governor of the National Bank of Kazakhstan. Welcome and thank you for coming. Armen Nurbekian, who is the Director of the Macroeconomics Directorate from the Central Bank of Armenia. Armen, good afternoon to you. We have also Carl Jonathan, he's a co-chair of Eurasia Economic Center, if I'm not mistaken, no? And last but not least, Victoria Nurger, who is a principal economist from the Inter-American Development Bank, and she's coordinating an important network among central banks in Latin America on greening the financial system, and she will tell us more about this. So one of the key takeaways and one of the key questions that we ask our panelists today, we were at the annual meeting of the Bank for International Settlement. This is an international organization that brings together all central banks around the world. And I was struck at the fact that there was few central banks governors coming from Central Asia. So maybe there is something already a case to be made that maybe there is a way to enhance first central bank cooperation in Central Asia. These countries are, of course, some of them landlocked countries. And what we can clearly see that maybe the process of central bank cooperation in terms of research, in terms of exchanging information, is not as developed as we can see in other parts of the world. So one of my first questions that I would like to address the panelists, do they see a rationale for enhancing central bank cooperation in Central Asia? Number one. Number two, if this is the case, what should be the modalities? What should be also the type of research that they would like to conduct among themselves, but also to try to do it with also the academic community and think tank in the region. So without further ado, why don't we start first with Deputy Governor Aliya Moldabekova to provide us maybe some input on her side, and what do we see is missing in Central Asia today? And we will go after to Armen. Deputy Governor, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Udan. Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, first of all, it is a great pleasure to be the part of this panel discussion. And I hope that Astana Finance Days will bring a lot of good communications to each participant. Mr. Udan, thank you very much. I think you highlighted some very kind of interesting topic to discuss. As we may know, and as we can see from our own experience, central banks community is the special community. And I think it is a very good level of cooperation and exchanging the views between the central bank, both in a regional and in a global basis. Of course, we know that there are a lot of places for us to make a good discussions, including IMF meetings in Washington, regional seminars, direct communication, technical assistance, etc., etc. So we think that central banks, because there are a lot of common things in their monetary policy, responsibility for the financial stability. There are a lot of common topics to discuss and to exchange views. Coming back to your question regarding the regionality, the community of Asian Central Bank, here I would like to stress that yes, because the landlocked countries, we have a lot of common problems, but at the same time, we have different approaches because of the structure of our economies, etc., etc. But as the common sense, the most of the central banks in our region responsible for price stability, a lot of the banks are looking for or already transmitting their monetary policy to the inflation targeting regime. So this is the very common and very hot topic for our communication and collaboration. But at the same time, I already mentioned that because of the differences in the structure of our economies, there is no one common approach to be kind of implemented. And in this case, we think that it is extremely important to use the experience, technical assistance, capacity development from other central banks outside of the regions of our region, kind of to implement the policies more or less kind of considerable within the particular economy. So in this case, my point is that we shouldn't kind of limit ourselves by only focusing on the regional cooperation. So we really would need to bring the best international practices to the region. And I think the best example of what I'm trying to say, this is the Regional Capacity Development Center, which was opened in Almaty. Because of the pandemic, because of the restrictions, unfortunately, we didn't open the center physically, only virtually, but hopefully we are expecting the physical opening of the center in November this year. But despite of this, since the beginning of 2021, it was a number of very good and useful seminars, video conferences on the topics that are common for the region, because this Regional Capacity Development Center includes the region of Central Asia, Caucasus, and Mongolia. So I think that's the best example of the regional cooperation. But at the same time, having in mind that this is the Capacity Development Center organized by IMF, we have this ability to share, to bring the best experience from the globe. So the best specialists from other central banks, including our colleagues from IMF, come and teach the local specialists. So that's, I guess, the best example that I wanted to mention.
Thank you very much. We come back to you later on for a couple of comments and questions, but let's continue our conversation and may ask Armen. Armen, please.
Good afternoon, colleagues. Good morning, probably to some of us, and it's indeed a great pleasure.
Для меня большая честь участвовать в этом форуме, хотя я, к сожалению, онлайн, но я здесь вижу, что форум идет очень хорошо. И я бы хотел подтвердить то, что говорила госпожа Молдобекова, что парадоксально наилучший образ регионального сотрудничества – это мышление на глобальном уровне. И это очень важный момент, потому что вызовы глобальны.
I'll touch upon the research agenda of the Central Bank of Armenia, so you can also see what are the commonalities. But I think given the challenges, and I don't think the number of challenges is going down, there is no way to get out of this unless you really think on a global level and target excellence. And openness is a very important part of this particular thing. So I completely agree with that point. Now, in terms of the Central Bank of Armenia's research agenda, our research agenda is based on our strategy, and the main pillars of the research agenda is first, a digital agenda, which is the digital financial system. I'll talk a bit about the what are the bottlenecks there. Second one, of course, monetary and macroprudential policies. And here, I don't think the world is boring. There was a time that monetary policy was considered to get more and more boring. Everything was going to digital. Fortunately or unfortunately, monetary policy is not boring anymore. So I will also touch upon a couple of points where I think there is a significant room for development. And of course, the third point, which is connected to the digital agenda, but basically the CBDC, which I wanted to mention as a separate central bank digital currency, is a separate topic. Now, in terms of the digital financial system, the important thing there is that we see more and more that the world is becoming more digitized. All the questions about what is going to be the financial system, how are the banks going to react to the digital world, these questions are out there. But in Armenia, Central Bank of Armenia, made a decision that, in any kind of circumstance, the fundamental infrastructure, digital infrastructure, is key. So the robustness and the resilience is key, and so that is why now Central Bank of Armenia and the government of Armenia together are investing into basically the sound digital ID, interoperability of data, and cybersecurity pillars, which will enable whatever future we see. It will basically give a fundamental notion to that, because what we saw, because you don't have that infrastructure, all the individual agents in the financial system have to invest heavily in this infrastructure. But at the end of the day, you get a piecemeal solutions, no interoperability, and then consumer protection becomes a problem, because the data eventually is not owned by consumers, and consumer protection is a very important part for the Central Bank of Armenia. So I think digital IDs and digital financial infrastructure is an absolute key. In terms of monetary policy, Central Bank of Armenia adopted inflation targeting regime officially in 2006, and one of the key aspects that we see now is that the monetary policy around the world, and we just undergone an external review on this, and there are two actually important things that we're going to invest in. One, the decision making under uncertainty is a very important point, because as COVID showed, and as the recent event showed, having just one baseline scenario just doesn't make sense anymore. So if you have one baseline scenario, and based on your decisions on that scenario, very hard to make any decision. That is why it's very important that we have framework where you can actually communicate with more than one scenarios, and also base your policy response more on risk management as a important part of the monetary policy, rather than just reacting to the central scenario. So this is a key development that we want to do. Second is it's a bit more technical, but I think important to mention is that we think that approach of having monetary policy rules, that also has to be reconsidered, and we need to look at the loss function, where basically one of the important aspects of monetary policy making for the central bankers is to look at the loss of the loss function, where you always balance between the aggregate demand and inflation. And importantly, important part of the job is to make sure that economy is steered away from so-called dark corners, as Olivier Blanchard coined it in his famous speech. So the point being, again, in many cases, central bank may not work on monetary policy as a based on a baseline scenario, but look at the dark corners, and part of the policy would be to avoid these possible dark corners. Currently, a good example is, of course, higher inflation expectations. We know that credibility is at stake now of all the central banks around the world, and the world where credibility is getting lower and lower, and inflation expectations are getting de-anchored. This is indeed a dark corner, which I think should be avoided. And by the way, BIS latest report, Mark, I think underlined that issue really well. The last point that I also wanted to mention is the consumer protection. I mentioned one point of the consumer protection, which has to do with the decision that Central Bank of Armenia made, which is that in the financial system, data is the owner. The people are the owner of their data, and banks, in the medium term, have to adhere to the principles, and the competition should be opened. But because Central Bank of Armenia is also responsible for financial literacy, an important rethink there, we see increasingly more important the behavioral part of the policy. So we think the policy has to be behaviorally informed. We have been investing a lot before into having many workshops, increasing the literacy of the people. Continuously, our research shows that you can, in a short run, increase the knowledge of people, increasingly difficult to change the behavior. And so I think the whole framework has to be fundamentally rethought. I think, so the last point is, of course, the CBDCs. We are looking at the CBDCs right now. Until end of the year, we'll be publishing our sort of the policy paper of decision and modalities of, if we want to have a CBDC or no. If yes, in what ways? I think the answer is far from being obvious. One thing is obvious: we need to have capacities if the world goes towards that direction. And I think the key elephant in the room, and this is where cooperation is very important, the interoperability and international dimension of CBDC, I think, is just absent, and nobody knows what's going to happen. So I think this is a big question mark for all of us. So I think I used most of my time, Mark. I'll stop here, and we'll be glad to answer any questions later on. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Armen, for this comprehensive remark and also the comprehensive research agenda. Let's go now to Carl. Carl, over to you, please.
Now you can hear me, yeah? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right, thank you. So on behalf of the Greater Eurasia Research Center, we are delighted to be part of this conversation. I think the issues that Aliyah and Arman have raised are issues, and we recognize one, is that it needs a global perspective. That is, you can't operate in any of these issues and any of the technical discussions without a knowledge and connectivity to global issues and to a global network. And secondly, a recognition that indeed the economies and the businesses are unique in some fashion. So clearly the issues around digital issues, policy issues, and currency issues are critical. What we see the opportunity is to provide that global linkage. So the center is working with HKUST in Hong Kong, together with the University of Chicago, in developing resources and networks. So specifically, what we see is the opportunity to have a multidisciplinary network of academics, practitioners, and policy experts, and to use the information and knowledge, not just in Central Asia and the Caucasus, but as well on other institutions and groups as IMF and ADB. Secondly, is to focus on capacity building and knowledge in programs and support that help. Clearly, knowledge helps bring about the management of risk. It may not change behavior, but at least identifies the critical areas that need to get looked at and provides support. The second is looking at online opportunities, which has already started, as noted in Astana and Almaty and elsewhere, but to expand that and to develop a base for further cooperation. And I think Victoria will give us an example of what happened in South America. But clearly, as you noted earlier, Mark, that sometimes there's a lack of representation from this part of the world. But what we've seen now, particularly with the global economy in a relatively unstable situation and the emergence of different geopolitical groupings, it requires us within this part of the world to look at these things in a different way and bring in a network and resources. So that's what we see the opportunity working with the Astana International Financial Center and bringing in resources from other parts of the world to help address some of these issues. So I think just to keep the conversation going, we can come back to it later on, but maybe Victoria now can share some more practical input.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you very much. I'm going to give the floor to Victoria, but before I give the floor to Victoria, you are principal economist at the Inter-American Development Bank. And if I look at Latin America, I will also argue that, yes, you have already some other research centers. You have the BIS Latin American office that do and cover central banks in Latin America. You have also the Technical Assistant Research Center from the IMF that I think is based in the Caribbean. But still, you were able, through the IDB leadership, to establish a network of central banks in Latin America. And maybe you can explain to our audience and to our counterpart here in Central Asia what was clearly the rationale of this network, how this network has been involved, because it seems to me that you have been involving numerous academics to provide independent research to central banks. So I think this is a very interesting point to showcase to our colleagues from central banks here that there is maybe a potential opportunity to establish something that doesn't rely only on international institutions like the IMF, Technical Assistance Center here in Almaty, or the BIS, that you have maybe the need to deepen your cooperation with think tanks in Central Asia, with academics in Central Asia, that when you go to the IMF meeting, when you go to the BIS, you come up also with maybe upgraded research, and you develop also your own local expertise, you know. So Victoria, maybe if you can give us your experience here for our audience and our other counterpart here. Over to you. Thank you.
Hi, Mark. Hi, everyone. Good morning from now in Mexico. So good morning from Mexico. So thanks a lot for the invitation. So going to the part of the rationale, why do we exist when we have, like, you know, as Mark was saying, the BIS here in Mexico, we also have SEMLA here in Mexico for, like, you know, the whole region. And so basically, I think it's because we provide more flexibility and we are demand driven by the central banks. So I'm a researcher at the IDB, but I'm also the team leader of this network that we call Financial Stability and Development Network, that right now we have 10 central banks actually most of the central banks in South America, part of this network. And it actually was created by a demand of the central banks. So they asked the IDB to create this opportunity of, like, you know, of this environment where they could discuss stuff in a more flexible and, let's say, I would say less bureaucratic, like, you know, institution. So we are very demand driven in the sense, like, you know, the Central Bank of Peru comes and asks us, oh, we are interested on thinking on a course, like, you know, building capacity on this topic. Who would you recommend as professor? So we hire that professor. If it's another topic, we go, like, you know, we have variety of topics, and we have, like, you know, this part of, so we don't want to compete with SEMLA or BIS or the IMF. That's, like, you know, for sure, we are all cooperating, but we also function as, like, you know, complements to these central banks. So, for example, you know, the BIS has these annual networks where, like, you know, they point the topic. And so every central bank has to do research on that topic. So we might be able to provide capacity building on that topic. We might be able to continue with the agenda that was created. So, for example, so I have a little presentation, but I think I'm going to skip it. I'm just going to tell you, like, you know, we have like 3 main points of our network. And these 3, like, you know, boxes, as we want to call it, are like policy dialogues, which we maintain a regular and well-informed policy dialogue discussing topics of current relevance to improve the mutual understanding and policy responses to the regional challenges. And here I think the regional part is very, very important, because the central banks wants to talk with what is going on, like, you know, in their neighbor country. How are they dealing with, like, you know, the same challenges? I mean, these are economies that are, like, you know, they are very different, like on many aspects, but on some other aspects are extremely similar, like, you know, labor informality levels, financial inclusion, financial literacy. So these economies need to talk to see how they are dealing with this, with these challenges, and how they are, like, you know, doing their monetary policy more efficient, given all this context. And so this regional part is very important. We might, I mean, we usually invite, like, you know, central banks from Europe or, like, you know, from like the US or Mexico, because, like, you know, it's very important to have also their perspective, but they also need to have the regional dialogue. They also need to talk with banks that are facing the similar questions in a context that is very similar to theirs. And so I think the global part is very important, as you were all saying, but also the regional aspect of it. we need to continue thinking about it. It's not that we need to move to I think we need to move to the global aspect right away. They might have best practices in another countries, but also you have to learn from your neighbors so you can do more efficient policies. So that was like the policy dialogue. Then we have the capacity building and training, whereas, we also have flow of some data, we create some data set that we share them among the central banks with data that might not be actually published in the central banks. But the good news is that, some of the databases that we created are now becoming public. So that's a good news. They start sharing with the other central banks in the network, and they decided why don't we do it public? The Central Bank of Brazil has it public, we don't. Why don't we start to publish it? So I think that's very good. Very good outcome of sharing data. And then we have a third box that is research. And we are building a common research agenda and knowledge dissemination. And something different. So we partner with the Journal of International Economics in the past, to create a special issue, to invite the best researchers in the world, to talk about stuff that are related for the region. That's about to come. But we also need to think that these central banks are very different, and the human resources that every central bank is different. So this year, we would like to have it for more than 1 year. Our funds are expiring, so have some limitations there. But the idea is each central bank has their limitations, so we are going to support the way they are. We don't want to publish the best research of the area, because maybe that's 1 or 2 central banks, but we want to push every central bank to create a working paper that is the best that they could do. And we know, capacities are very different. So we want, one one professor that is gonna, support them, and they're gonna take, the best of them. And I think that's working very well. And every central bank was very happy, especially the smallest one and the ones that have less human resources and less time to spend on these topics, because there are fewer people. And so, I work at the central bank, but you guys know much better than I do that, you start working on something, but as a researcher, but they need you for other stuff, because of course, right now, monetary policy is getting much more interesting and it's not boring anymore. So we need to provide answers right away to different topics. And so the research time assigned to you might be changing all the time. So you also need to align the incentives between your research, the research that you're pushing, and what the central bank is relevant. So if the central bank think that research is relevant, I'm sure you're gonna have time to spend on that research project. And that's something that actually we have been facing for some central banks, that they like this project, they wanted to support it, but it wasn't relevant anymore for the policy discussion that the central bank was facing. And so the project drops. But if you have a correct alignment between what you are supporting inside your bank, that project might continue, and you have the advice of a great professor that is actually discussing with your researchers about this topic. And I think the discussion at the end of the day for monetary policy becomes much more interesting. So I stop here, but happy to continue talking afterwards.
Victoria, if I may, before I give the floor back to our colleagues here, I see that your network is now called Greening the Financial System, no? So is it your research? Please.
Not yet. We ask for resources.
Okay.
We ask for resources. We see if we're going to be able to get them. So no, that's not official yet.
That will be the next frontier of research, hopefully, for you and your colleagues, in terms of climate change and how central banks should be thinking about financial stability issues and so on. Why don't I get back to our colleagues here? Armen, you want to comment on maybe Victoria's experience, and do you see here something that can be done also because I think what I think is important here is not, to replicate I will say what the IMF is doing, what the technical assistance centers are doing. I think it's also to bring back the Central Asia regional dimension. You know, as you said, you have cooperation among yourselves, but we never see when we go to the IMF, you know, an academic or central bank or providing the view coming from Central Asia. Of course, your countries are different, you know, but as you said, you are dealing with global problems. So even having, you know, emerging, you know, economists from Eurasian, that I think I see a potential here. That's why I think it will be good to pursue the conversation. Amen.
I think Victoria's points are excellent, and indeed the one thing, for example, the very first point that Victoria mentioned, which is the policy dialect platform. Right now, this is an extremely relevant topic because the countries in the region are facing similar shocks. There is also regional global shock. We have all experienced very turbulent last 3-4 months. And even the question, how is everybody dealing with the issue, is very important. Like, for example, in Romania, exchange rate depreciated by 15% after, you know, in the beginning of March, and now it's actually appreciated by 20%. And the question is, all these countries face the same roller coaster or no? How are we doing, in terms of doing so? I think this policy dialect point is excellent. Of course, both Ms. Moldabekova and I sit on the SICAMTAC board, which is the IMF's Regional Assistance Center, which is also based in the Almaty. And then, of course, I don't think there's a replication issue. So I think this policy dialect point is absolutely essential. So it can be done. Now, second point, which I think I would also agree, part of being relevant, I think the reason of, the best reason to be relevant is because you can produce high quality stuff. I think that's the best way to be relevant. And research and data are two very good ways of doing it. And I think data sharing, especially the micro data that all of our countries have, can be a very good way to attract good researchers and working on this particular issue. So I think both are very good point. And finally, the third, I think the last point I wanted to mention is, I think in the central bank, you really see high quality research whenever it's really connected to a real policy issue. So whenever it is not connected to a good policy issue, I think it's a bit of a, you can always spend lots of resources, bring big names, but very limited impact. So that's why I think, the policy dialogue is the first fundamental sort of the building block, where you can recognize what are the issues that everybody have, and then you can, on top of it, start more of a, basically more serious data sharing and research agenda issue. And right now, I think, for example, the same exchange rate, FX interventions, and all these issues, and they're always relevant. In Latin America, they're very relevant. They're relevant everywhere. And I think this is a good policy agenda to pursue. So I think Victoria covered it very well. I agree. So maybe we should start, at least meeting once a year and just discussing what are we up to.
Thank you, Armen. Why don't we go now to Alia, please, if you have any comments coming from Victoria presentations and insight.
Yes, thank you very much. I also wanted to highlight that Victoria raised a very important, very good topic, and I wanted to elaborate a little bit what Victoria and Armen said. I totally agree with the point that we need to develop policy dialogue between the neighbors. And here, as Armen mentioned, it would be great to meet at least once a year to use, let's say, think tank methodology. And I would like to highlight the issues that could be very relevant to the region. First, of course, monetary policy issues. We are facing the consequences of tightening the monetary policy. We are facing the high level of inflation and inflation expectations. So, of course, it is the hot topic to discuss within the region. Also, it is very important to understand that as the region, we need to discuss more general things. For example, attraction the foreign investors, foreign investments to the region. Another issue, financial stability, the kind of the stability of financial institutions in the region, the potential improvements that we could do in our prudential policy, in the policy of our regulators, etc. So I think these are very important issues that could be and should be discussed on the regional level and further on developed on a more kind of a global level. And in this case, as Armin mentioned, historically, central banks have very good capacity building teams, research teams. In this case, sharing the views, sharing the results, I don't know, of the experience of, let's say, stress testing, etc., could be really very useful, taking into account that the situation globally and in the region is a very volatile one.
Thank you. Carl, please. You are muted.
All right. I'm all right now. It's kind of like being in Mexico, only a little bit colder. So, you know, the points made, I think, are very relevant in that given the volatility that's going on in the world, but also as well as in Central Asia and the Caucasus, the informal communication, and in particular, Armin mentioned the collection of data and databases that can be accessed, particularly by a wider group. And so I think that is something that we're looking at in the research center with HK and with Chicago is how do we build a platform that allows access and obviously security, but gives us data so that we can have better insights, because a lot of that is getting the data at the right time and in the right place. So I think the points are well made. I think the informal connectivity is important. Structures and other things, you know, are there. But I think opening up communication and dialogue, and what we can do is really support whatever initiatives in Central Asia and the Caucasus, and particularly providing outside resources from either Europe or the US to come in periodically together with IMF and ADB and others. So it's a cooperative effort on an informal basis that gets the quality of data such that we can really make a difference when the research and policy discussions are made.
Thank you. Well, thank you, all of us. I think I will conclude with giving you maybe just an outside perspective and give you the example of something that's been created in Europe called the CEPR. The CEPR is called the Center for European Policy Research. That's been established more than 30 years ago by Richard Portes. And what they have done over many years was they built a group of academics, researchers, and built special program on international macroeconomics and monetary policy. And this group of academics have been working closely with central banks, so they were able, you know, over the years, you know, to organize with different central banks from Europe, you know, special programming on topics that were very relevant from central banks. And now this network has been well established. And in fact, because as Victoria said, you know, this is driven demand. If there is a demand from central banks, this network has been working very closely with all central banks in Europe on very important paper on monetary policy, on international economics. So I think something along this line can be a very good model for Central Asia. I think coming from the academic community in Central Asia, being able to provide also, you know, suggestion to central bank on policy that has been, I mean, the term of policies and term of topics has been very well described by our two representatives from central banks. I think now we need to identify here in Central Asia, you know, the expertise coming from the academic, and to build this network that I believe will be quite relevant for central banks. And I will also suggest to our colleague from central banks, you know, you all been invited to Jackson Hole, you know, the important conference organized by the Federal Reserve. A couple of years ago, the ECB decided to do something similar, and now they have the ECB Sintra. So I will suggest to you to organize something similar for Central Asia, because that will help you to set up this policy dialogue, but of course to invite the important central bank from advanced countries, because we are all taker of monetary policy coming from the Federal Reserve or ECB. So that will create also, which I think is relevant to all of you, Central Asia identity, because you are part of Central Asia and Caucasus, but also realizing that you share many things together, and particularly the major new challenges that all central banks are facing, the inflation restart and the implication of that inflation for the world and for monetary policy. On this, I would like to thank all of you for participating to this session. Thank you for joining online, and we hope that AIFC, who is behind this initiative, will welcome you face-to-face soon in Kazakhstan, Armenia, or other part of the region. Victoria, thank you very much, because you are providing some very good input coming from other parts of the world. And we look forward to see the next step of this initiative coming from AIFC and Carl. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you
very much.